it's not like trauma isn't, well, was the car crash actually that bad? Or, you had to go through war or abuse. And like, it can be like you misunderstood the circumstance.
I'd love to hear you guys talk about kind of like how you explain trauma in general, what it is. This is something I think personally I have a hard time with, and so I'm coming as a real kind of like, I don't know, kind of like a hesitant voice in that conversation because I've just heard so many things explained as trauma. So my definition is like any seeming I can't even do it with a straight face. I was going to rip off your definition actually so Matthias in their episode, I was going to try to do a straight face.
That would have been great.
Matthias says
like, stoked.
Any seemingly overwhelming experience that creates a maladaptive way of coping with fear and overwhelm that has a self-reinforcing cycle to it.
Yeah.
What would you have done if I just rattled that off?
I would have loved it. I would have been like, I agree completely.
You wouldn't have said like,
no,
wait.
I would have let you had it.
Oh,
that
that's
would be great. Well, yeah, that's the difference. So there's a few pieces there because that can sound like a big wall of words, but
I've never heard the word maladaptive in my life. Yeah.
Hey, well, some people don't have it. It's like maladaptive just means like it's not working. Maladaptive just means like, oh, I keep doing this and it keeps making things worse.
Okay.
Right. So it's like trauma is a seemingly overwhelming experience. The word seemingly is important there because it's not like trauma isn't, well, was the car crash actually that bad? Or, you had to go through war or abuse. And like, it can be like you misunderstood the circumstance. And then because that's how you experienced it as overwhelming. So for example, you get a divorce, you think the divorce is your fault as a kid. Now that could be not true. Your parents would never say, well, it was your, fault, Jimmy. But because you were 9, you didn't know any better. You concluded it was your fault. You hold the shame of that. And then that could be traumatic for you, even though it was, you misunderstood. And so any seemingly overwhelming experience that leads to a maladaptive coping mechanisms, that just means like it leads to you trying to solve problems in the world, but in a bad way. So addiction's a good way or a good example. You feel really depressed. You try to lighten the mood with some alcohol. You feel really anxious. You smoke weed and then just try to take the edge off. But so much of that starts to kind of spin out of control. And that's the last part. It's like it has a self-reinforcing cycle, meaning, I smoke so much weed because it helps me sleep, but actually then the weed starts to like disrupt my sleep, right? So I think it's helping, but it's actually making it worse. But, I'm so tired, I need to use the weed to sleep. Oh crap, the weed's making my sleep worse. So there's that loop that is actually really important. To use another example, social anxiety. That's one of my favorite ones. It's like you go to a party, let's say for your friend that is having a birthday, you have to go. Be weird if you didn't go. You're standing in the corner and you're like, what do I do with my hands? Do I put them in my pocket? I shouldn't be touching my chest this much. What am I doing? And then it's like you're in a conversation with someone and then the whole time you're thinking, what do I do with my hands? I don't want to be weird. I don't want to be awkward. And then they ask, well, okay, so what do you think? You're like, wait, what? What are they asking? Because you weren't paying attention. You were thinking about your hands. And then you see that they kind of glaze over in conversation and they're not really paying attention anymore. And they kind of walk off and you think, I knew it. I'm so awkward. I hate coming to parties. But what you don't realize was the fear, the coping mechanism of trying to hyperanalyze how you should be acting and what to do with your hands so that you can come off normal, got in the way of you having a normal conversation. Yeah. And so the thing you were doing to try to help made it worse. And you didn't catch it. That's the point. And so that happens with anger issues in marriage and kids. That happens with shutting down in conversations that feel really stressful. That happens with depression, anxiety, all sorts of different things. And so my definition of trauma is just that. It's seemingly overwhelming experience that leads to maladaptive coping, a bad way of acting in the world that makes things worse. And it keeps making things worse and you don't realize that you're contributing to the problem. That's not to say all the stuff that comes from trauma is your fault. There's nothing like that. It's just, it's technical because I think that helps us narrow down exactly what we're talking about. Trauma can mean all sorts of different things to different people. That's specifically what it means to me. I think precision there is helpful.
Yeah, Scott, I'd love to hear kind of what you think
about
that.
Well, I think some people don't realize they have experienced trauma.
Yeah, that's right.
Like they're telling me their stories or they're telling me some of these things they experienced and as if it didn't affect who they are today. And then when I kind of parrot it back to them or say, just listen to me and just listen to what I'm telling you. No, doesn't that sound traumatic? They're like, it's like they don't realize that affects their behaviors today or their thoughts and their processes. And I like to take, with people that go through trauma, it used to be, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that was everything. But that can be separate. You can have experienced trauma that affects you, but you may not have quite a disorder, so to speak.
In the same way you can experience anxiety, but not
Right.
have an anxiety disorder.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right. And so trauma is used a lot today, but I think it's because we all experience trauma somehow, likely, by things that happened. It maybe affected us in one way that may not have affected another person.
All of us have been overwhelmed.
Yeah, and through churches, and people have experiences through churches, or staff members or people in ministry have all kinds of trauma that they're realizing oh, it was trauma, not just that I was fired, It's more like what affected them, with the description you gave.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
yeah.
Well, it's hard to embrace sometimes other people when they say something was traumatic, and you're kind of like, really though?
It's used,
like
it's used.
yeah,
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
it's used
I
for
was-
everything. Kind of like
So what bothers you about it? Tell me about that.
you really want to know?
I do. Yeah.
You're-
I'm
you're
not
asking me.
calling you out or anything.
No,
I just
no,
want to
you're
know.
asking me. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So what bothers you about people using that word really liberally?
I think it bothers me that language has really started to take on like no meaning, and I think a lot of conservative people talk about this. Like I would generalize myself as a more conservative person, like politically and even theologically and things. But when words really start to lose their luster, because like sometime in the last
Purpose.
they lose their purpose. Sometime in the last 6 or 7 years, everybody's a racist. But like, how did that happen? Did we all just not know we were racist because we voted for a certain person? Do we, so suddenly if everything's racist, then like what actually is, right? If everybody's a Nazi, if every conservative is a Nazi, what does that make of
everybody's a
Nazis? Like
narcissist.
actual Nazis? Yeah.
Everybody's a narcissist,
So then when you can't really, those definitions and those terms really kind of lose, you stop giving them as much attention as maybe they should get when somebody, it's kind of like the crying wolf idea. So if you're talking if all you can talk about is like, oh, this trauma, and it's like, well, yeah, but like that happened to me. And you guys kind of addressed this in your first podcast too, like the family, the idea of the family that has, 3 or 4 different kids, like me and my siblings, we lost our dad when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old to drugs and alcohol. And it's like, well, that definitely, it seems to have affected me differently than my sister, than my brother, who are younger than me. And each of us probably differently. I don't know how, but differently. So you give an example in that episode of this or maybe your other co-host did.
Yeah,
I forget his name.
Frank.
Frank. So he, this person becomes a CEO. But this one struggles to get by, and
That's
this
right.
person, this person's kind of somewhere in the middle, and it's like, how did we all experience the same thing but come to different end results or become such different people? And that trauma it just shaped you differently. So I think you look at other people's trauma and you kind of, or their experiences, and you kind of compare yourself to them and think like, well, I went through this too, and I'm fine. You just need to suck it up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've heard that over and over, both of you. But hey, you life is just hard, and I think you again
I think
you touched
that's
on
good.
every one of these things, every one of these counter things that you've probably heard so often. But hey, if everything's trauma, is anything trauma, right? And so I understand
here's
this
the
idea of
one-
a spectrum.
Here's the one thing
of
I'll
that.
say on those points is that the only reason I think trauma kind of gets a pass here, and I wouldn't say in every single case, like obviously the drive to work, the traffic is traumatic. Okay, well maybe not.
Yeah.
But like if someone's genuinely in like with a emotionally congruent, disposition saying, oh, that was traumatic. It's hard because for the reason you just named, something traumatic for someone else, the seemingly part is really important there. Something traumatic for someone else can be traumatic for them, even if you went through something really similar and it wasn't traumatic for you, because we have different barometers of pain tolerance, different experiences that those confirm or disconfirm, because trauma is not just what happened in the present, it's how that informs everything I've been through up until that point. And trauma, the key symptom of trauma is avoidance. So it's not something that normally comes up unless someone's trying to use it for some sort of social utility. And I think that's what conservatives really respond to, is like when people say, oh, I've been through trauma, you need to make accommodations to
Right.
essentially dance around my particularities.
Right.
That's the allergy that I see to the word trauma being used really frequently, because people are like, oh, my boss gave me a demerit at work because I was late. How traumatic. Is almost to say he's in the wrong morally, because if he was an empathetic, kind person, he wouldn't have punished me for being late to work. Now, I think that's almost a side issue from whether using the word trauma is accurate or not there, because for them, if genuinely it is, if they're like overwhelmed by the idea of that, then I'm like, whoa, okay, then we have to totally reshape how you think about employment.
Yeah.
If this is actually a feasible job situation for you, if you actually need to find a totally different social support system, because I'm just going to assume that's true. And then the ramifications of that are you have to take some personal responsibility to radically reorganize your life. Because if you're getting constantly triggered at work by someone writing you up late, then you're going to be completely just like falling apart if you keep at this job for another year.
Right.
And then immediately you'll see on their face if that's a genuine description or not. Because if they start to feel a little bit insulted by that, then it's like, oh, hey, come on. Then it's like, oh, okay. Well, then that wasn't overwhelming. Then that's what we would call adversity, which is suffering, but not overwhelming suffering. And then we can have a conversation around what does it look like to take responsibility in this circumstance around your job. Because I do know people that like their work and getting late to work is just really overwhelming for them, like especially folks with ADD and trauma and just like some of the responsibilities. They are trying their best and they're showing up late and projects are getting turned in on, aren't not getting turned in on time. And if I look at them and they're like, oh man, like when he came at me for being late, that was traumatic. And they really mean it because they've been struggling with their ADD so much and it's been so hard and they've lost 3 jobs already. And if they lose another one, then they're going to like lose rent and da-da-da-da-da. And if I roll my eyes at them and say like, really traumatic, then like they're going to shut down, they're going to close up. And then we're going to get no closer to actually solving the problem, which is maybe this style of job with this structure isn't what's right for you right now. Like maybe you need a different sort of job. You need something that's more on demand. You need to drive for Uber so that you can pick your hours and pick when you stop. Like it's actually in taking personal responsibility for your actions instead of demanding the world change around you that I think solves the big problem that most conservative folks bring up when we're like, I've got to stop using the word trauma. Because I'm like, does that make sense? I could go on, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. So when people come, I mean, you mentioned like spiritual trauma, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate you asking kind of my thought on it, and it's even awkward to explain it because you don't ever want to come off like people's trauma is not intense and real and severe and serious, and it's formed the way that they are, and it's formed. I think you talk about an underlying. You said avoidance is kind of how it plays out, but the underlying issue is fear.
Yeah, that's right.
Fear of the same thing happening again. Yeah. Fear of kind of like falling into kind of what the caveman thing.
Yeah,
that you guys use, like or Frank used. Okay, touch fire, fire burns. Don't touch fire. Like stay away from fire. When it's like you've got to figure out how to use that experience to navigate.
I love how you brought up spiritual trauma. Sorry to cut you off.
No,
but spiritual trauma. I think pastors get so allergic to this phrase because they were in the circumstance. They saw what happened, and then they hear on a podcast later or something like that pastor was abusive.
100%.
That pastor traumatized me.
Right.
And it's like, hold on.
Right.
And that's why seemingly is a really important
in your definition. Yeah.
Right? Because I'm not talking about the objective nature of the abusive thing that happened.
Right.
I'm talking about the subjective experience of the person. That actually has no bearing on the pastor. That has everything to do with the person who experienced what happened, and then them taking personal responsibility for the harm that they experienced is maybe they do need to step out of that church. Because let's say, just to put a random example on it, a pastor that just had crude joking, and then a female on staff said, oh, he tried to sexually harass me. Yeah. And it's like, oh, come on, it was just a joke. And then it's like, well, who's at fault there? Yeah. All right, well, for her, that was overwhelming for her. And she didn't know how to confront and have like assertive, like, hey, that's not inappropriate. If you continue to joke that way, I'm actually going to leave. And I'm going to bring it to the elders and we're going to have a conversation about it because I think you're in the wrong. I think you're being immature. Maybe she didn't have the resources or the social support to make a risk like that. Maybe this office job is how she's providing for her kid. So like it's not incumbent upon her to have to do that. But for her taking personal responsibility, that could look like, I'm actually going to get a different job. I'm going to go find this elsewhere so that I can kind of personally recover from something that felt overwhelming for me. Yeah. Because My self-reinforcing maladaptive cycle was that I was just quiet, and then I got really nervous and scared, and then I just kind of disconnected from that, and then I let kind of an immature behavior fester, not just within the church, but just even around me, and then that continued to be hard for me for years, perhaps, at that job.
Yeah.
So can you see how, like, there can be two different experiences, and we're not talking about is the pastor an abusive pastor? We're talking about that someone experienced something overwhelming, and that's not the same thing as we need to go after the pastor now. It's like that person needs to find a way to hold their own overwhelm in a way that's right for them.